I want to begin by thanking all of you on the work that you and your staffs did on the Alaska plan. I know that several months ago we had a hearing where you all committed to make the decision whether you were supportive or not by the end of the second quarter. And we were close. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work you're currently doing to finalize the CAF2 funding issue, and I know that the staffs are working on that as well with Alaska's price cap carrier. And Mr. Chairman, you mentioned it, it's all about coverage, of course, particularly in the rural communities, particularly in the extreme rural communities that I like to say. You know, I was out, like all of us, back home over the summer and was in a lot of communities that are still struggling. You know, sometimes you think about the most remote communities that don't have a lot of activity. I was actually out in Unalaska, Dutch Harbor. This is out in the Aleutian chain. This is the #1 seafood port in America. So it has enormous economic activity out there, but still really, really concerned about, you know, the lack of broadband access. And I know that the work that the commission did is going to help on that. So again, I want to thank everybody for working hard on that issue for my state, which I think has some unique problems or challenges. I want to broaden the discussion here, though, building on a little bit of what Senator Daines was talking about small businesses, and broaden it to kind of the broader issue of the lack of economic growth that's going on in the country. This is an incredible, dynamic industry that all of you oversee, and yet when you look at our growth from our nation's perspective in the last 10 years, it's been very substandard. President Obama will be the first president that's, I think, on records never ever hit 3% GDP growth in one quarter. We've had a lost decade of economic growth, and one of the reasons I think that's clearly happened is that we overregulate ourselves in so many different sectors. So we've had the Secretary of Transportation here saying it's take 5 to 6 years on average to permit a bridge. We had the head of the Seattle airport who talked about it took 14 years to get a permit to expand a new runway at SeaTac. In the oil and gas sector, it took 7 years and $7 billion for a company to get permission from the federal government to drill one exploration well off the coast of Alaska. 7 years, $7 billion. We're our own worst enemy as a federal government on inhibiting economic growth. In the last hearing, all of you committed to working with us on looking at legislative recommendations on the way we in Congress can assist the FCC in helping streamline our processes and get projects moving, get dirt moving, starting to build things. So I offered an amendment on the Mobile Now that would have an application deemed granted if there's a certain amount of time that passes on construction on federal lands. But what I really want to hear just from all the commissioners is on this issue, I know you've been thinking about it a lot, but what are the big issues that we need to help deploy the resources of this very dynamic industry so we can start growing the economy? And I know you've been thinking about it. Commissioner Rosenworcel, I know you've been thinking about it. Can you, and I really want to open this up to all of you, what can we do? What should we do to help us start building things in this country again, particularly in this very dynamic sector of our economy?
Thank you, Senator. You know, we now are in the early days of a wireless revolution. It's becoming such an important part of civic and commercial life, and the challenge is to get it built everywhere, especially as we move to a new future with the Internet of Things. And we spend so much time talking about spectrum and what's happening in the skies, and the least glamorous part is what's happening on the ground, but it deserves twice as much attention. We need dig once policies all around the country, especially in federal lands, to make sure every time we have a construction project, we also lay fiber. That fiber serves wireless facilities and towers. We need to start holding contests for communities and tell them there's a reward in it for you if you figure out a way to expedite wireless deployment, particularly of small cells in new architecture and infrastructures. And then finally, I think when it comes to federal authorities, which control about 1/3 of our nation's real estate, we should make sure that there are master contracts and that they are required to use them. And if we do that, we will standardize and harmonize it and actually achieve some more build-out.
Well, we want to work with you because those are all, you don't, Mr. Chairman, you don't have the authority on those kind of issues, right? You need legislative approval to do that kind of streamlining to deploy these assets. Isn't that correct?
There is a debate over that, Senator. I have been very encouraged to hear my two colleagues today talk about how we have to step up to the question of preemption of on siting issues. We need to respect the rights of localities.
Of course.
But the rights of localities do not extend to thwarting the construction of the information pathway of the 21st century. And how do we work that out in a balancing act? And that's what the art of the possible is.
Well, we want to work with you, Mr. Chairman. I know my time's expired, but we also want to work on your ideas on federal lands, because to me, that's where we clearly have a jurisdictional role. It doesn't get into the issue with the smaller communities and localities, and I think it's an area where we can get a lot of bipartisan support to start building things. And I want to work with all the commissioners on these ideas because I think we can really achieve some bipartisan consensus here on some of these important issues. So thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Senator, can I do 30 seconds? T.W. Patch is the guy who deserves the credit for getting the ball rolling on the Alaska plan that you were talking about. And I just want to make sure that he gets the public recognition.
Well, he's a good friend of mine, so I'm glad that you're mentioning this in this hearing, and I'll pass it on.
Great.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan.